And Colby, kick it off.
All right. Thanks so much, everybody, for tuning in. We've been working on this for a long time, back and forth. Roper's busy, I'm busy, whatever happens, but we finally did it, folks. We really did it. Professor Roper's here to speak to us about science fiction. I'm really excited. She sent us a short story by Octavia Butler, I believe. Is that right? Called Bloodchild. I don't know if you had the chance to read it, but it was really disturbing and good. And I really can't wait to hear what she has to say about it. So yeah, take it away, Professor Roper.
Yeah, I feel like that's a lot of times how most of things are labeled for me is disturbing but good, right? I feel like that's just kind of my brand. So thank you for that. Dr. Phillips, can you allow me to screen share on here so I can do that?
Oh, sure thing. Sorry about that.
Not a problem. I should have asked you earlier when we were chit-chatting.
Should be all set.
Perfect. Thank you. So, hey guys, so excited to be here. Happy to talk to you guys. Thanks, Colby, for having me and kind of working through this whole process with me of getting here. So when Colby and I believe Carl both kind of reached out to me to start with and asked me to kind of do this presentation, my first thought was, oh my goodness, what am I going to talk to a bunch of philosophers about that I'm not going to totally get like drug across the coals, right? Like this was my first thought. Because I do have a little bit of a background in philosophy. I had a liberal arts education, so I had a lot of that nice background of story and narrative and philosophy and all of those other things besides science, but I've stepped away from it for so long that I'm a little rusty. So coming back to it has been really interesting. So I thought that I would kind of combine two parts of my identity to talk to you guys today. The first part being the science part. My PhD is in molecular and cellular pharmacology. I tell people it's a really fancy way to say I look at how cells communicate. So to design drugs to mess with that process, that's my background. But the other part of my identity is actually film. I grew up my entire life running movie theaters. So this is what I did as my family business. So I'm very ingrained in the whole motion picture process. And so since I had kind of those two, I thought I'd talk about science fiction with you guys. And hopefully as we move through this today, I'm going to try to convince you guys of some things about science fiction. And then once we kind of get through maybe about 15, 20 minutes of me just kind of setting the stage, what I really want to do is turn it over to you guys and discuss this short story that I shared with you guys and what you kind of think of it within this context. So when I talk about science fiction, I usually talk about it in terms of kind of a red flag. Science fiction that is really scary, science fiction that resonates with us is the type that has just enough truth in it that it seems like it could happen, right? This is what makes science fiction ultimately appealing and scary. And science fiction is a wonderful medium because the types of things you can approach and the different categories that you can get through in science fiction are vast. There's tons of them. And so just kind of quick brainstorm rundown here with you guys. There are different ways to define categories in science fiction, but these are kind of the ones that I usually use. First one being class warfare is a very popular topic for science fiction. And so we see things like the Hunger Games and the Purge, which for most of you young people are ones that you more remember. But one of my classic favorites is Logan's Run, fabulous film. I think this is perfect that we're doing this before spring break, by the way, because I'm basically going to give you your Netflix watching list for over spring break, right, when you're just totally on the couch. Another theme, human genetics, and specifically our manipulation of human genetics is a really common theme in science fiction. Gattaca is a classic for this. And then we've seen kind of newer versions of this, such as Splice, and even video games have gotten into this conversation with the video game series Doom, which was then turned into a motion picture with The Rock. So, right, it's fabulous because The Rock's in it, and that's how that works. Downfall of society, so the complete collapse of it. The Mad Max, which has seen kind of a resurgence, right, with the more recent release in there. Movies like Waterworld, as well as Soylent Green. And for most of you younger people, you're like, Soylent Green, what is she talking about? This is on your must-watch list. This is classic Charlton Heston, first off, which is like, Charlton Heston is such an interesting character. And the thing I think that's also really funny in reviewing this, Soylent Green takes place in the year 2022. So this is next year. So guys, guess what? We're going to get through the virus, and it's going to be Soylent Green is going to be the outcome of this. I won't spoil the ending for you if anybody decides to watch this, but it really is kind of a good classic sci-fi film. Replacement or destruction of humanity. This is another really common category. So The Matrix, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and then Stephen King's Dreamcatcher, which was a book and then turned into a film. Of the two, I highly recommend the book over the film, just saying. That one's a little bit better. We also have power of television and media, and this is one that maybe resonates very, very strongly right now with a lot of us when we see all of kind of the fake news and conspiracy theory that's been happening over the last 6-7 months. So movies like Rollerball. Rollerball is a total classic with James Caan. You've got Schwarzenegger in Running Man. And then not a film, but actually one of my favorite books that kind of deals with this power of television and media is a story called The Long Walk. And originally, the author listed on this was Richard Bachman. Richard Bachman was Stephen King's pen name for his few books. And The Long Walk actually is set in a society where food and resources are scarce. And so in order for someone to basically win money to take care of their family, kind of like an early version of the Hunger Games type of a situation, these kids are able to come in and do what's called the walk. And literally they are just walking from one location to another. They do not stop, they do not sleep, they do not eat. If they fall down at any point, they are shot. And so the game is, can you survive the walk from one point to another? And it's broadcast on TV, and people line the streets, right, to cheer people on. And it gets turned into kind of this sporting event, which is really disturbing when you think the sporting event is watching children basically walk themselves to death. Like it's kind of a really disturbing kind of thing that television and media can kind of create. Viral spread and infection. Once again, we're living this one at this current point in time. The Walking Dead ultimately deals with virus spread because that is why the zombies show up, is it was a viral leak. Stephen King's The Stand, again, I thought this one was worth talking about because if you have, I think it's CBS All Access, they just did a remake of The Stand. Matthew McConaughey's in it. And then 28 Days Later. These are all really good examples of viral spread infection. And then kind of last but not least, we have the rise of the machines and artificial intelligence category. So common ones here, Schwarzenegger, Terminator, that series has lasted forever, right? We have so many Terminator movies now, it's long-lived. 2001, A Space Odyssey, total classic. Once again, that one should be on your reading list. And things like AI or artificial intelligence, right? So these are all really kind of good examples of more popular, common machine artificial intelligence type films. So besides the whole kind of I get to sit and eat popcorn and drink soda aspect of this, why should we actually talk about science fiction? Well, as a genre, science fiction is extremely powerful. I propose that the task of science fiction is to contemplate possible future outcomes based on the scientific pursuits of today. That is what science fiction is. Now, sometimes the creations that we get from this are extremely fantastical, and we're like, no way, never in our lifetime, will not happen, won't see it. As far as I'm concerned, Back to the Future is entirely fantastical because I still don't have my hoverboard, right? So like they totally lied to me and they weren't able to create something as simple as a hoverboard. But others, they're very real. If you look at many science fiction movies in the 70s, early 80s, they were already dealing with this idea of global warming. They didn't know what to call it at that point, but they were dealing with that concept. Whoops, sorry, ended up all the way back here. And with science fiction, we have also seen that genre as entertainment shift as our view of science has shifted. So if you look at a lot of scientific writings and any types of short stories that came out around the earliest 20th century or before, science is the savior of the world. It's going to make everything better. There will be no more suffering. We will all be great. And this mirrored the discoveries and the advancements we were making at the time. Beginning of the 19th century, we created air conditioning. We had the first airplanes, the first cars. We had the first motion pictures. And even the first crayons were invented in the earliest 20th century. So all of these things were about making our lives better and making them more fulfilled. However, after World War I and World War II and creation of the atomic bomb, science all of a sudden became the boogeyman, right? We became the villain. We were what was going to be everything that was wrong. And I think it'll be really interesting to see how our science fiction genre changes with this current pandemic that we're in, because maybe all of a sudden we might win back a little bit of favor, right? We created the vaccine. Maybe we kind of saved things a little bit. So I think it'll be interesting to watch how that changes moving forward. Now, there's some really good examples of how science fiction reflects our current fears. And there's some examples that are very, very on the nose. And two of my favorite ones to really talk about are first, The Night of the Living Dead. And if you have never seen the original black and white Night of the Living Dead, this is another one that needs to go on your list. I credit this film for starting my love of horror and science fiction because my father thought it was a good idea to show it to me at 6 years old. I slept with the light on in my bedroom for 3 weeks, right? But it kind of hooked me, right, and got me into this. So Night of the Living Dead was released in 1968, and this is when we see the first humans orbiting in the Apollo 8 mission. And if you watch even just the first minute or two of Night of the Living Dead, the cause of the zombies seems to be a strange meteor or comet that is passing close to the Earth. So this fear of the unknown, this fear of space, is really inherent in Night of the Living Dead. It basically causes the dead to rise. And as soon as the comet passes away, everything goes back to normal. And then really popular, both video game as well as film series, once again, one that has lasted for years, Resident Evil. The first video game came out in about 1996. And that video game, in the original writing of that, as well as the movie, they talk about the T virus. And the T virus basically enhances human DNA, right? It adds DNA into the human genome, and it causes these mutations. In 1990, we announced the start of the Human Genome Project, of mapping the human genome. And so this was kind of a step forward from this, saying, you know what, once you have it mapped, you can change it. And what could happen, right? And so it kind of played on that overall fear. One of probably the best examples of, I think, long-term fears and how they have kind of changed is the Planet of the Apes series, right? So as far as I'm concerned, I only want to really talk about the left half of the screen. We're not going to talk about the reboots because, you know, they just, no. I love Tim Burton as a director. He's one of my favorite, but that Planet Apes reboot he did was an atrocity. It should never have been allowed. It was a crime. But in dealing with the Planet of the Apes, we actually see our fear of science, and we see how it changes over time, but we can keep the same narrative to talk about it. So if you think about the first original series of Planet of the Apes, that was in about 1968 to 1973 was when those films were. And it was dealing with the abuse of experimental animals and basically vulnerable populations. So we're talking about, for instance, lab experiments where PETA was especially prominent in freeing animals, and animal testing was first coming out. We also had sterilization of certain populations across this country into the 60s and the 70s. We still are today in some instances. So all of these things are getting wrapped in with nuclear war, as well as this fear of space travel that started in about 1968. Ultimately, all of this comes down to talking about the fear that science is manipulating the natural world. All of these things kind of come together under that umbrella. Now, when we go to the reboots, that ranged from about 2001 to 2017 of Planet of the Apes, we are still afraid of science manipulating the natural world. However, now we're concerned with big pharma, right? We're not really as scared of space anymore. We're more concerned about big pharma, which we didn't need these movies to tell us that, because currently, right, the new COVID vaccine has microchips and it's going to modify our DNA and all of these types of things. It's a ploy, right? Big pharma released COVID, so we would basically buy vaccines. It's all about making money. And then the idea of human-animal hybrids. And I say human-animal hybrids, and a lot of people would be like, what are you even talking about, human-animal hybrids? We are currently generating animals such as pigs that have and can grow human organs for organ transplant. And so there is a lot of debate and question around whether this is something we can do, because while making a pig that has a human liver might seem just kind of weird, what happens if we can make pigs that have human brains, right? And so this kind of fear comes into this again. So different methods, but still manipulating the natural world. I like to think of science fiction as serving a purpose in the way that really philosophy does too. Science fiction is a thought experiment, right? This is our chance to sit and think about these things that we normally wouldn't do, right? I do not want to create a post-apocalyptic world, right? Maybe like take Australia and take all their stuff away and then just see what happens, right? And try to recreate Mad Max. That's not what I want to do. That's not a good idea. So it gives us the chance to kind of think through these things. And for scientists, this is important, because a lot of times we get so stuck in and ingrained in this idea of, can I figure this out? Can I dissect the natural world and understand it? That we kind of stop, or we forget to stop and think, should I, right? Is this a good idea? And we see this a lot with announcements about scientific discoveries. I feel like scientists, when they go to announce a scientific discovery, they are kind of like that kindergartner who goes to school and tells all of his classmates during show and tell about something that his parents are doing that he probably shouldn't, you know, like mom and dad are growing weed in the basement or something. It's super exciting, it's super new, and they want to share the information, but really bad idea. And that's kind of how science is shared in a lot of ways. We just want to share it, and then we're like, oh, maybe that wasn't a good idea. So I would posit that these are kind of our form of thought experiments, like philosophers undergo thought experiments. Now, not to say that in any way that those are equal, right? So philosophy thought experiments are kind of like what things should turn out if you follow the recipe on Pinterest, and science fiction is more kind of like, can I get an award because I tried, right? I did it. See, looks great. Didn't turn out the same, but you know, okay? That's kind of how I see these thought experiments. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't science fiction films that really get at philosophical topics and arguments. There are some good examples of those. Some of these you guys are probably already familiar with, and some of you may not be. So dealing with the idea of a person as embodied informational patterning, or what actually makes a person. Is it the string of memories? This is, of course, Locke's work. You have The Matrix, The Minority Report, and then Star Trek Next Generation, right? Because you have data. Data is a computer, basically acting as a human. When it comes to reality of the external world and this idea of epistemology, you have things like Total Recall, Tron, and actually Avatar. Avatar is kind of, I think, a great film for having this conversation, but once again, I never want to see Avatar again. I file that one under the same atrocity as the Tim Burton remake. It never should have happened. I'm opinionated on film, if you hadn't noticed. We also have the nature of time travel and the paradox of time travel. You have things like Back to the Future, 12 Monkeys, and then the story by Ray Bradbury, The Sound of Thunder. Okay, these are all, it's more of a short story, not one of his longer novels, but it's a good one to have those types of conversations. And then last but not least, I think my favorite area to talk about is the ethics, transhumanism versus bioconservatism. And this has to do with, while we may be making these technological leaps and bounds, should we be modifying humans in the genome? Should we be placing technology in humans? And with that, we can talk about Planet of the Apes, for instance, is a really good example of this. Brave New World by Aldous Huxley is a fabulous story that covers this type of idea. And then last but not least, one of my favorites that I will recommend as a reading list to you guys by Margaret Atwood is Oryx and Crake. A lot of you might recognize Margaret Atwood's name for The Handmaid's Tale, right? It became that big TV series. She has other works besides The Handmaid's Tale, and Oryx and Crake is part of a 3-part series. And she really deals with this ethics of scientific invention. And I actually used to teach this book as part of my bioethics class, and it's a really interesting read, so I highly recommend it if you haven't. So that's kind of my framework, right? This is what I sat down and kind of thought about before I wanted to come talk to you guys. And so that brings us to talking about Bloodchild and what this is trying to get at. So Bloodchild, science fiction story, and it is a thought experiment. So I wanted to kind of open it up and ask you guys, based on your reading, what's the thought experiment here? What are we trying to get at? What are we thinking about? Are we just thinking about alien invasion? That's what this is all about? Is that what the book's about? Oh, come on. You guys have to have some ideas.
This is the first time I think I haven't heard the philosophers have a lot to say. You ought to be proud.
Right?
You ought to be proud of yourself, Lindsay. You've done something I don't think I've ever been able to do.
For me personally, I feel like there's kind of 2 angles to come at it. For one, the way that the alien species is treating the humans is kind of analogous to the way that we treat animals. We just kind of like harm them if it's gonna help us to like live our lives and be happier, even if it comes at their expense. We're willing to do that. And the other angle is kind of like, well, the humans kind of have to help these aliens if they're gonna grow and be their best, you know, because if the aliens use an animal, a non-human animal to grow and be born, they won't be their full size. It seems like they don't develop properly. So it's kind of a question of, do we actually have an obligation to non-human beings to make them live their best existence, basically? And I think both of those are like pretty hard to answer questions or just topics.
Oh, very interesting, Colby. I like that take on it. Did anybody else come up with something different? I'm asking for your interpretation, right?
I have some thoughts that I'd love to talk about, but I want to make sure that students have the opportunity to say something first. So let me know when you want me to step in.
I wasn't able to read the whole entire thing, but what I got from the first, like the big first chunk of it was is that it just makes us think about our relationship between parents, thinking about previous, the necessity of having a parent, and what will happen if that is changed or broken up.
Nice. Awesome. So if you guys didn't totally hear that this necessity of having a parent and relationship with parents was a kind of a synopsis of that. So that's also a really good take on this. Anybody else come up with anything? I can see Dr. Ellison is so excited. She's like, I've got a thought here.
I mean, it seems to me to be a metaphor for pregnancy and the ways in which, like, by taking it outside of the just like, male and female humans having babies, trying to reveal something about the at least potentially oppressive nature of pregnancy.
So I loved everyone's take on this. This story is actually really interesting. It's been misinterpreted for years. A lot of people thought that this was about slavery or this was about fear of the unknown. There's been all these interpretations thrown out. And Octavia Butler finally came forward to answer the question of what this was about. And this is what's called a male pregnancy story. This story is a thought experiment of looking at if we instead had males be the carriers of children and the producers of children, would they stand for the same level of kind of constriction and invasion of privacy and pressure that we put on women when it comes to childbearing? And so this is literally transferring the baby over to the other gender and saying, are these things okay? And it's funny when you approach this story through that lens, that you see actions that you're like, oh, that's wrong, right? That's horrible. And it's because it's an alien doing this, right? But then you look and we find the same thing occurring to women when it comes to fertility and pregnancy within our society. And it's something that we just kind of gloss over and don't consider. So yeah, pregnant men, not like twins, right? What was the one with Arnold Schwarzenegger when he ends up pregnant? I forget the name of that old movie as well.
Junior, I think.
I think it was. Yeah, I think it was Junior. Yeah, so not that type of happy-go-lucky, but kind of looking at the darker side of this. So since Dr. Ellison got it closest, what were some passages that kind of made you think about that, or some specific spots?
Me personally? Yeah. One of the things was just like the depiction of the procedure and kind of the way that like the procedure is kind of supposed to be hidden in order to make sure that people are still willing to go through with it. And we do a similar thing, I think, with childbirth, and the idea that even sometimes the way that mothers who have born children themselves talk about it is in this like weird sort of veiled way where as a person who's never birthed a child, I can't quite tell what their perception is of it and what their experience was. And so I think that that way of sort of like being shocked at the when you do encounter an actual depiction of childbirth, it's like quite shocking and unappealing. So I think that was one of the places that drew it out for me.
Yeah, definitely. We have that moment where I always have to write down the names because for some reason they just don't work for me in this story. Teagal the Alien, right, has to cut Lomas open, and he's just totally like ready to be sick because of this whole situation. And we see this a lot with our conversations about how we talk about childbirth, right? It's supposed to be this beautiful moment of watching your child be born, right? You'll hear people talk about that. Oh, we're going to videotape it. We're going to film it so we can watch it again because it's going to be so wonderful. And it's like, no, there is blood, there is body fluids, there is stuff all over the place. People are screaming, you're covered in sweat, like all of these things, right? It's not this beautiful thing, yet we talk about it in that way. And we create this kind of veiled false language. And so you kind of see repeated in the book where they say, you shouldn't have seen that, right? You shouldn't have, or it won't be that bad for you, or, you know, kind of trying to cover these things up. And so we kind of do that, which is weird, right? Like, I feel like if I'm going through a procedure that is going to not only affect my health and maybe possibly my long-term life, but the life of the thing I'm bringing into the world, you'd kind of want to know what's going on. I think one of the other places that I kind of wanted to discuss with you guys from a philosophy standpoint that I thought was really interesting. So let's see, I think my page numbers showed up on my scans for you guys. I tried to make them anyway. Is in that conversation that Kui ultimately and Gon have, right? The two brothers when they're having this conversation. And that starts on page, kind of starts on about page 19, right? And we see this difference between these two brothers. We see that Gon has always been like, okay, yeah, this is what I'm going to do. This is fine. And Kui is like, no way, I would never let them do that to me. And we see this kind of fear on one side, we see anger on another side, and we have this huge mix of emotions. And so how does that kind of relate to how we talk about this process of reproduction in our world? Where do we see these gigantic mix of emotions kind of all getting rolled up and this confusion? I left him speechless again. Dr. Phillips should have warned you. Anytime you ask me to talk about stuff, I am totally going to talk about uncomfortable topics. It's just how it goes. This is the way I function.
They're usually accustomed to that. I don't know what's going on today.
Maybe. We don't talk enough about pregnancy in our philosophy classes, though.
But I hear you teach about feminism.
I've never been pregnant, so I don't really have much to say about it.
Socrates talks quite a bit about being pregnant with ideas and giving birth to farts and stillborn babies. Yeah, so.
Yeah, and he describes himself as the midwife to knowledge, right? In the Theaetetus.
That's right. So, Dr. Roper, will you repeat your question again?
So in the conversation between Gon and Kui, the two brothers, we see this back and forth kind of mix of emotion of anger, uncertainty at both each other and then at the process. And they kind of go round and round and we see this emotional change. And so my question to you guys is, where in our current dialogue about reproduction do we see a lot of this emotional kind of turmoil come up?
For me, I think that like, well, in the conversation you see Gon taking on like a sort of excusal of the behavior in saying that the alien species cares about the people that they're like using as hosts. And Kui not really taking that stance, believing that it's really just about reproduction and about their survival, and they don't care about the humans. But ultimately, they come down to like the topic of consent, and that carries like a big weight in the scenes afterward.
That's awesome, Colby. Yeah, this concept of consent definitely comes into play here. So we see kind of later on that conversation between Gan and whatever her name is, Gatai, that weird alien name. I'm not sure how to pronounce that one. When he says, "You never asked me," right? I want you to ask me. And when he's talking to his brother, Kui, we hear him say, "You know what? No, you're not a person to her. You are property." So we kind of see this interplay with consent. Definitely shows up in there as well. There are other passages that kind of hint at also abortion, right? Which is a kind of an area where we tend to have some very heated arguments. There is one point, I think it's page 20. Is that the one I want? Yeah, so we see in an instance here where Kui is talking about the story that he saw on the side of the road, right? So he saw this individual that basically couldn't go on because the grubs were eating him. There was no way he could get to town. And the alien said, "Well, I won't take them out because if I take them out of you, you will not survive." Or I'm sorry, the grubs themselves will not survive. And so he ends up in so much pain that he begs her to kill him because there's no other option. And this is a really kind of powerful statement in that it comes back to in the context of where we talk about whose life is more valuable. Is it the life of the mother or the life of the unborn child? And in this kind of roadside story, we see that here. What else? What were some weird, I guess another way I can come back and ask this question to you guys is, what were some passages that hit you as kind of weird and disturbing that kind of made you step back? Because those ones that hit you as disturbing are probably the ones where she's trying to make a point.
I think for me, it was the implantation and the like conversation about like, will she implant him or the sister? That was the bit that was most disturbing for me.
Yeah, right. So we find out that when she finally asks him, "Can I have permission?" and he says, "No, go to my sister," he then suddenly has this kind of emotional reaction of, "Well, wait, I can't let this happen to her either." And come to find out that the alien basically had a fertilized egg and it was going to get implanted no matter what in someone that night. So it's kind of this veiled idea that, yes, I'm giving you a choice, but really, was there a choice ever there? Right. And to me, at least, I think this is kind of a far stretch. But this, in a lot of ways, reflects abortion laws in our country, because we say that abortions must be accessible. They must be there for you to access. However, in places like Mississippi, Louisiana, a lot of places in the South, there is one abortion clinic in an entire state. People cannot access these. They are not open. They are not available. And so that choice, even though there's a, kind of this veiled idea that there is one, it's not really there. And I think that passage was really kind of trying to point to that idea.
So, Professor Roper, you framed your initial discussion around sci-fi as sort of sci-fi as a warning. We're employing these sort of extravagant thought experiments to draw attention to potential pitfalls of science or some sort of ethical problem that could be coming up, given the advancements of science, given these sorts of things. Do you see this as issuing some sort of warning, or is it more of a commentary? And why? And we can turn that to the rest of the audience too. You can do that teacher thing where you're like, that's a good question. What do the rest of you think?
I know, right? I love that trick. It's such a good trick. So actually, I have an idea of a way I want to respond to you, and I promise that I do. But I would like to actually hear what the students have to think about that before I say it. What do you guys think to Dr. Phillips' question? Is this a warning? Is it a commentary?
For me personally, I think that it's more of a commentary because there's no resolution. I really doubt. I mean, at the end, that like there's no solution. Like what is Gan supposed to do? He doesn't want to let is it Skatoy, or is that the alien's name? I believe. Doesn't want to let her like line die and like go, like he cares about her obviously, but it's still a horrible process. And I think in a similar way, like I don't think that I don't know the author's opinions, but I don't think the author would say that we ought to just like end the human race by never having children ever again. But it's still an ethical concern. Like, how are we supposed to go about this and actually make it so that everyone has a choice and that we don't make people suffer unnecessarily? So yeah, I'd say it's more of a commentary.
Awesome, Colby. Yeah, I think that's a great point. So Caroline says that she interpreted it more as a commentary. Caroline, are you in a position that you can expand on that? I know your microphone's not on. I don't know if that's because you're just in a spot where you can't or not, but. No, she can't. Okay, perfect. Anybody else that is able to answer Dr. Phillips' question?
Chris, could you go ahead and repeat that again? I was reading the part that I had read. Can you hear me okay? Is my computer weird? Can you hear me?
You're really hard to hear. You're really quiet. So I think we're typing. Anybody else want to jump in? So I think my answer to Dr. Phillips is I consider this to be both, actually. It is a commentary, right? It's saying that this is what the past has looked like for women. And if we then flip the gender, we can hopefully see how horrible this is. But I believe that it also serves as a warning because we are moving to the point where we are beginning to understand how male reproduction works, right? We are getting to the point that we understand how to make versions of male contraceptives. We are getting to the point where we understand how to control that reproductive process. And so in the very near future, there may be some laws and some policies that ultimately start to infringe on male bodies where they haven't before. Where will it ever be at the level in which women are? No, right? It never will be. But there are some ways that that's going to start creeping in. And so hopefully it's serving as a warning of, unless you want to be infringed upon, you should make sure that others are not infringed upon.
I think that's really interesting. And the way you put it there made me think about like the limitations on the, I don't remember what it's called, but the alien species ability to reproduce. And the idea that like it was like really nice that humans came along, because before that it was like these, there were not ideal circumstances for their reproduction, and it was a big issue. So it's almost like there's a way in which as we start thinking about male contraception a little bit more, where will there come a point at which men also, they do not have a way to reproduce in the way that these aliens did not have a way to reproduce for a long time, and the sorts of problems that may or may not present.
I think that's an awesome point, Gretchen. And one of the other places that they totally play with that idea, not in this reading, but let's see, it would have been about 2 or 3 years ago. It was actually a Stephen King novel that he released called Sleeping Beauties. And in this novel, basically, there is a sickness that comes over people, is what they call it, as a sickness. And women, when they fall asleep, basically get cocooned in this like gossamer type of a situation. And so all of a sudden, women are disappearing off the planet. And we're left with like a male only planet. And so the men are just thinking basically that the women are dead, right? And we see this like utter like chaos and destruction that ultimately occurs, right? And fighting and things like that, right? Because that's what men do. That's all they do is grunt and fight with each other. But then the women are actually in this like collective conscience in another dimension. And they are basically land there with nothing, and they start rebuilding society. And so like you see women actually are going through and they're like, oh, well, let's set up, farming, and let's set up all of this. And at the end, they are given a choice. They're basically told that there is a sperm bank down the road that is still working. And so you can literally restart the human race in the way that you want to restart it. Or you can go back. And they're given that choice. And it's such like an interesting interplay. It's like, wow, right? Here is talking about men have no way of continuing. Scott, no, not go back. Men have no way of continuing the species, right? There's no way in order to do that. You need women. Women, as long as there is sperm, guess what? We can get it done. It's fine. And it's a really interesting interplay that follows that idea. And I think it's one that this idea of the ease of reproduction that you bring up is something that's so central to our country and our history. Because I would actually argue that controlling the reproductive narrative has been something that we have needed in order to succeed for this country and has led to our success. By basically controlling women's bodies, making sure reproduction occurs, and controlling such as things like genetic mixing and racial mixing. And we have that kind of dark history of doing that. And so this idea of control and pushing back and forth, and whether reproduction is easy or not, is something that's kind of cool to think about.
Well, I would hate to be that guy, but I'm going to have to be. Unfortunately, Professors Fitzpatrick, Ellison, and I have another meeting in just a couple of minutes here. And I'd also like to be respectful of Professor Roper's time. She's taken some time out of her very busy day to come and join us. So let's thank her for spending some time with us. Any final thoughts, Dr. Roper or anyone else?
No, thank you. I would just say thanks for having me. I love getting a chance to talk science fiction. So anytime anybody wants to do that, please look me up. I'm more than happy to sit and talk science fiction and movies.
Okay, great. Well, thanks so much again. Thanks everybody for coming, and let's see if we can make another one of these happen sometime in the near future. This is really great. And thanks again, Lindsey.
Thank you
See
so
ya.
much.